One of the most powerful ideas we've laid out is this notion that if you're an exec in particular, you are the head of talent for your organization. It is a pure accountability, expectations, and prioritization reframe.
So what does it really take for your business to attract world-class talent today? I'm Dave Travers, president of ZipRecruiter. And on Talent All-Stars, we shine a light on the people and the day-to-day processes behind recruitment and retention at some of the world's most influential businesses. Today's Talent All-Star is Brandon Sammut, the Chief People Officer at Zapier, a no-code automation tool that helps cut out tedious tasks so its users can focus on the work that fittingly only people can do. Brandon's held that title since 2021 through a period of expansion and a hiring slowdown, which we're about to discuss. So let's start our conversation by revisiting a challenging time for technology companies. This was back in 2022, coming out of the pandemic. Zapier, like a lot of internet businesses, had been doing a lot of hiring, but a new economic reality was setting in.
Yep, I think we all remember that. It was a tremendous change. And, like a lot of other leadership teams, we could see some of the signals, even in late 2021. But by, February 2022, it was clear that something was changing. And interestingly, during that time, Zapier never stopped hiring entirely, but it was a good litmus test for us to look at, which roles matter most for where we're going, not simply where we've been. And it inspired both, changes to the hiring plan, which we could talk more about, but also some changes in how we think about how we're going to redeploy, reskill a lot of the brilliant folks that we already have at the company. And, that was kind of mission number one as we were refactoring the hiring plan. And it also inspired a change in our overall talent strategy. Our number one focus at this point is what we call talent density. Glad to talk more about that.
Let's double click on talent density. So when you have a big change in how you're thinking about how many people you need, what types of skills you need, et cetera, what's a framework like? How does it help you navigate through something like that?
Sure. There's a framework that we think about called the 4 Bs. And it's inspired by actually a classic framework I think we're all familiar with. It starts with 2, which is, when you're thinking about, a capability that you need on your team. And again, we're talking about capabilities very specifically rather than people. So, the capability could be, writing code or debugging. It could be design or recruiting, whatever the case may be. One of the classic frameworks, 2 Bs, you're going to build or you're going to buy, right? That capability. You could, so that's helpful. It's a great way to start. We also started thinking about, well, what are the other levers here and how are we going to stack rank them? So this gets to your question, Dave, around what's the framework? So build and buy, great place to start. We introduced 2 more. The third is borrow. And that has a lot to do with, you have this amazing team. We have 730 folks globally at Zapier working from 42 countries. It is a mighty and a talented team. Most of the roles in the organization have peaks and valleys in some sense, right? Period high seasons and relatively low seasons in terms of demand of the work that needs to get done. And so the borrow lever is really about how can we better understand that seasonality and then kind of proactively think about how do we reposition or redeploy folks around the company based on where the greatest needs are at the time. So that's the third one. And then the fourth one, which I think was kind of the one that hit me in the head because I was like, oh, this is the most obvious one for an automation company like Zapier, we call bot. And bot's all about, using things like Zapier, to, make it easier to get stuff done and to, boost our output effectively, if not take over some of the tedious tasks entirely.
Yeah. I think so almost every technology company went through the exact same thing. And I think so many people earlier on in their career who are not yet 2-time chief people officers, like you, dream of the moment when they can have a seat at the table where they're thinking about what's the framework I'm going to use with the CEO, with the executive team to shift resources, reallocate what talent we need. Talk about your journey to get to that point. And, you have taken a non-traditional route, I would say, starting back at Teach for America, even where your journey to chief people officer. So someone who's dreaming of that, who's early on in their talent career, but thinks about making it all the way up to the C-suite like Brandon has. Like how do you guide them through that, and what's a story from your journey that sort of makes a point about that?
It does look a lot like a random walk, but maybe the first thing I could say on that topic is if I look at my like LinkedIn profile and the path like job to job, it looks very surprising and unusual. What I think about instead, like my core motivations, like what I really care about, my personal values, I am 0% surprised that I ended up in a role like this. And here's what I mean by that. I grew up just outside of Detroit, in a family that had a lot of auto workers, a lot of blue collar jobs, and some entrepreneurs too, but not tech entrepreneurs, not the glittery, kind of entrepreneurship, small business ownership. And I was surrounded by talent growing up. I was surrounded by brilliance. And yet I saw so many places, even early on, as early as high school, where, folks weren't able to realize that potential. And it stood out to me in high school. And I went to college. You study a little bit about different talent systems, talent markets, how organizations operate, org behavior. And, you start to understand some of the root causes of that inefficiency. And that is actually really what's motivated almost everything I've done in my career, even though the job titles and types of organizations look very different. And so, like you said, Dave, I did start in education. I worked in higher education. Then I worked in management at Teach for America. I was recruiting Teach for America teachers and then helping build the infrastructure to scale that over time. Did some finance and operations and some corporate partnerships work there before going to grad school to study this some more. And in grad school, I was really interested in how technology could play a role in better matching what people are capable of to opportunity to really flex those muscles. But then, practically speaking, I saw a lot of promise in software. And instead of going right back into talent and HR, I wanted to face the customer. I was looking for a software company that was going to let someone straight out of grad school with no prior tech experience do effectively business development, sitting right in between the product development team and the sales team. And I looked for really in my entire last year of grad school, I kept hearing like no's over and over and over again. One of the lessons I learned there is, when we're having like a hard time making something happen in our careers, it can feel isolating. It can feel shameful and discouraging. And sometimes the reaction there is to kind of like go inward. But the best advice I got was go outward. And what I mean by that is tell people what you're trying to make happen. And tell them you're having a hard time making it happen. Like the whole way I got into tech for the first time, I worked at an amazing company called LiveRamp. And, the introduction to that organization, I wouldn't have known about it otherwise, came in a coffee chat with a grad school classmate, where I was just being really open and humble about the fact that I was trying to make something happen and wasn't working and I wasn't exactly sure what to do next.
Incredible advice. So let's double click on that go outward rather than go inward. So I think that is counterintuitive to a lot of people who want to show, who have big ambitions, want to show that they're being successful, et cetera. So talk about to someone who their instinct may be to go inward and think a lot about what they're struggling with or whatever, but not necessarily to be vulnerable and open about it. How do you talk through someone on your team at Zapier or somebody that is looking to you as a mentor? How do you build that muscle if it's not natural to you?
I find in coaching folks around things like this, there's usually like a big idea that's not on the surface, that if they can pull that idea or that mindset up and really like stare at it, it's the enabler. It's what can get them over the very human, like you said, Dave, like, discomfort with saying something's hard, or I feel like I'm just like I'm having a hard time with something. And, for me, part of what helped me and what I coach to in situations like this is just the notion that, generally speaking, people want to help people succeed. And everyone's also had these experiences. So if you have a conversation with someone, or you're thinking about, should I have that coffee chat and talk through what I'm trying to do and say I'm having a hard time with a mentor, a manager, a peer, whatever the case may be. It's a really powerful idea to center, which is that, we've all been there. That's thing one. And thing two is people want to help people be successful. like overwhelmingly so. All walks of life, all seasons of life. And again, if we keep that front and center, I think that's sometimes we all, and me included, like need to hold an idea like that, like right in front of us and stare it in the face to get over a lot of the, natural discomfort with, talking about stuff that we're struggling with.
So let's go back to something you said a little bit earlier too, which was, as you look back upon your career, it may look non-traditional or may look like a random walk or something, I think you said. But what you said that I think was super interesting was, if I think about that journey and where I ended up, knowing who I was even earlier, I'm not surprised. What was it about you? What is it as you look at what you're doing now as a chief people officer for the second time? What is it looking back that is not surprising to you? What do you know about yourself that makes this such a good fit?
I'd say on the mission purpose side, it builds on what we talked about earlier, which is just like, wow, like for me, it is incredibly motivating to be accountable for building systems that help people be the best person that they can be. And, practically speaking, the thing that I feel really lucky about is that that's very personally motivating. It's also very valuable to organizations, people who can come in and help people be their best. You think about this like, oh, that sounds like really fuzzy. It sounds, like, is that like social work? It's like, well, you can get that. You can, for a lot of folks, something like social work can fill your cup in a very similar way. But it also so happens if you do this at the systems level, you are doing like kind of top grade, HR and talent work, and organizations of all shapes and sizes really value that. So it was a neat way to match something that was personally motivating with me with something that's important and marketable. So like, it's great to be able to, take some of those same skills and interests and, put them to work in a way that, again, I think is good for the organization I work with, good for the people in the company. But it also, it makes a difference for me and my family too.
Okay. So I want to pivot to thinking about your role as a executive, not just a leader of talent teams and people teams today, because I think a lot of people coming up in their careers, whether it's in people and talent or what have you, get the opportunity to rise because they're superstar individual contributors. They're motivated, they want to make it happen, et cetera. But then all of a sudden they rise to the point and look up to people like you, where now you're advocating cross-functionally for something you need. You need more people, you need more resources, et cetera. How do you approach that for the first time? Or how do you advise someone who's a rising leader in your organization to approach that for the first time when that's not something they've ever been expected to do before?
It is, Dave, to your point, probably one of the hardest professional transitions that anyone can make. And it's interesting, right? Because we've all been managed. And we all know managers. So it's like, okay, you kind of see that work happening. Turns out it's a different thing to actually be a people leader, to ultimately, be an executive. And just like you said, there are, mindset skills, that really help that I think are sometimes non-intuitive. And what I mean by that, one, what else it reminds me of too? It's kind of like, when it comes to teaching. So this brings me back to my Teach for America days. It's like, well, everyone knows teachers. We've all been taught by teachers, so it's like, it's kind of intuitive. Though. Wouldn't we be able to turn around and then teach? Because we've seen and experienced so much of it. It's the same thing with management. It's like, it helps if you really come back to it, you can unlock empathy and some understanding, certainly about how the things that managers do and how they lead is experienced by people. So that's good, right? And actually, sometimes when folks are coming up into management, it's one of the powerful things you can remind them, because it does typically, take you back or peg it to, or at least it did for me the first time I was a people manager. We hear this from new managers at Zapier all the time. It's like, wow, this is in fact a pretty different thing. It's humbling. We try to take an asset-based point of view with that. So one of the nice, first coats of paint you can put on as someone's transitioning is remind them, hey, but there are things, like, it is new. And so good for you to be able to recognize that, like, you got a bunch of stuff you got to pick up in order to be a really skilled manager and leader. However, you are not starting from scratch. That combination of yes, it's challenging, but also you're not starting from scratch. It really unlocks growth mindset. Right. It's an asset-based way of thinking about that. Also still very realistic about the hill that folks need to climb. And then practically speaking, the other thing that I think helps too is that it's actually a little bit of an org design opportunity is, in organizations, what can we be doing to make sure that we are valuing recognizing, rewarding the work of individual contributors, just like we do leaders. In terms of what do we celebrate in the company all hands? Zapier does one every Thursday. Like, who gets to hold the mic? Is it only the executive team or senior managers? Or, is it, regardless, like the IC or manager, like whoever's doing the thing that we really want to showcase, like give them the mic. And thankfully, Zapier does that. It was, in the DNA long before I got here. Similar thing with job ladders, for example, like how high in the organization from a pay and job level perspective can you go as an individual contributor? Do you offer, a lot of companies offer things like leadership coaching. Individual contributors lead. Now, this is a powerful idea. You and I are talking most explicitly about management and people management, but leadership, that's a broader set of skills. And, I sure hope that, individual contributors get to develop those leadership skills in their organizations too. So from an org design point of view, if you set things up to remove some of the typical lopsidedness of incentives for ICs and managers, the other thing that happens is that the folks who ultimately step into management have done it knowing that in many cases they could have had similar rewards and recognition staying on the IC track. And so there's something about people management itself that is motivating. And so that's more of a systems or structural thing that I think does remove some of the funniness about folks stepping into management, including in cases where they kind of know darn well, like it's not necessarily in their zone of genius.
So there's so much. We could do a whole podcast series just on the answer you gave. There's so much there, but I want to double click on one thing that I heard that I think you won't hear a lot from people that I love what you just said, which is about giving people the mic. Now, you referenced it in one very particular case, which is Zapier has this culture of giving people the mic at weekly all hands meetings, which is awesome. But I think there's a generalizable skill as a manager and as a leader there that's super interesting. And that sets the tone for culturally, as I hear you talk about it, which is when you are playing a leadership role, whether you're just assuming it in a meeting or you're leading a project or now you're leading a team or whatever, there's incredible power in being the person who calls upon and hands the mic, even if no one even knew you had the mic. If you're the person who hands the mic to the person who, is really smart, but maybe isn't the super extrovert, who's super observant, who you really want to hear from and making sure by the end of the meeting you hear from them, or the summer intern, that has been sitting in on these meetings, but hasn't said anything after 8 weekly meetings or whatever it is. Taking the mic and then just for the purpose of handing it to someone else is an incredible people management skill. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, you could say, Dave, that it's ultimately, having been an exec for almost 10 years now, personally, I would tell you that there are only a couple things that I can uniquely contribute in the organizations that I help lead. One of them is setting vision and direction. But even that, I think, benefits from being done in a collaborative way with the teams involved, and oftentimes with your end users too. Like that should be feeding the direction and the goals as well. But the second thing is what you just said, which is talent development. You get to an organization of even 50 people, much less 500, 5,000, 50,000, and those senior leaders, like the best ideas in the company aren't coming from folks like me. A lot of the more important decisions, interestingly, when you get bigger, also aren't necessarily coming from the exec team. Even the decisions that go on a list of things, even the questions that go on a sheet of paper to be answered, even if it is ultimately by the leadership team, some of those most essential strategic questions do not come from the executive team, even if they have to help the organization navigate them. And so, one of the most powerful ideas we've laid out at Zapier, and it really helps, is this notion that if you're an exec in particular, you are the head of talent for your organization. It is actually not me. It is not our actual head of talent. There's only one person in the company who actually has the job title head of talent. It's the very, but if you think about it, it is transformational. And interestingly, often in my experience, doesn't require a lot of additional skill development for the executives. It is a pure accountability expectations and prioritization reframe. And to the extent that, and then you get to build it into all of your talent practices. So, with that being, kind of established at a place like Zapier, we get to do things where we have a company-wide talent strategy. We have a company-wide talent plan. That's great. But again, you get to an organization of any reasonable size, and it's hard to say any one particular thing definitively about what the organization needs. or what the next talent priority ought to be. And so, in keeping with this idea that execs are the head of talent for their organizations, again, we have this company-wide talent plan. That's great. But each exec builds a department-specific talent plan that, often will link off of the company-wide plan, but also has some things that are maybe more specific to their context, to certain skills that really want to develop in their workforce that we wouldn't necessarily do across the whole company. Or they want to put a focus on increasing the rigor of how goals are set, or they do want to develop, they want to increase the ratio of internal versus external fills when they have that next open role in the organization. And I smile when I talk about it because I've been dreaming about this world where this can happen. And, again, all credit to Wade, our CEO, here at Zapier. It's one of the things we talked about when I was thinking about coming here 3 years ago. And that was a really neat point of alignment that got me excited about, what we can be doing. And again, we've got plenty of work to go, but 3 years in, we're starting to see some of the fruit of that.
I love that. And what an incredible way to build a bridge and build a relationship as a talent leader to your internal clients who are leading businesses or departments or divisions or whatever the case may be, to say, rather than come in and say, hey, I'm the head of talent, here's our talent strategy, tell me what you need or your feedback. Say, hey, you're the head of this department. Obviously, you're the head of talent for your department. My job is to help you be successful. We're not on opposite sides of any table. I'm not playing some functional role for you. We're partners. You obviously have in many ways the same job as I do for your department in particular. How do we do this together? What a great way to start off a collaboration, build a relationship. I love that. Okay. I want to move to the rapid fire portion of the festivities here on the podcast. So what we do is give you a couple questions and really think about how do we model and give examples of how do we model sort of upward communication, executive communication to a fellow C-suite executive or to a CEO, where you have 60 seconds, you're in the elevator, proverbially speaking, and thinking about, how do I relay some information really quickly? Because this is a situation people find themselves in, and sometimes it's their first chance to make a big impression. So we get in the elevator together. And I, as the executive, say, hey, Brandon, how's it going? Hey, what's going on with the people team? What's the number one way we should be thinking about measuring, the impact of the people team or how the people team is doing?
I would tell you really simply, by the time we get in that elevator, we've already done 90% of the answer to that question, which is we have aligned on the goals. Again, at Zapier, the North Star is talent density. We have some specific measures around that. And I would tell them, at the end of the day, my team is accountable for creating the systems that enable our leadership team. And this is the difference in accountability. The answer to that question is not, I am accountable for all of those results, because they're around things like, productivity metrics and retention. And, those are shared goals in a really high functioning talent system organizationally. I sign my name next to that, but so does the rest of the executive team for their portion of the company. So I would say, thankfully, the answer to that question is very straightforward. We've all signed our name next to these goals. The only thing that we should talk about regularly, I would say in the elevator, is how well is my team showing up for you and your team in delivering your piece of this puzzle.
Don't talk about yourself and people-specific goals. Talk about the company's goals and how you're supporting it. I love that. Okay, so next question. Hey, I'm brand new executive at Zapier. I've got a huge team I now have to go build. I've interviewed elsewhere, but Brandon, you're the expert at this. Give me your one best piece of advice as an interviewer. How do I become better at interviewing people?
Listen more, talk less. And specifically, take whatever questions you were going to ask. If you had 8 questions, cut them in half. Do 4 rather than 8, and just go deeper.
Give me a tip. How do I go deeper? If that's not my go-to motion, give me a piece of advice on how I get deeper.
Oh, sure. Your first degree question might be something like, tell me about a time when, you navigated, conflict to get something important done in your organization. They'll give you an example. And oftentimes they'll give you a pretty good one. You could ask them hey, and underneath that, were there certain principles or values that you use to figure out that, to determine you were going to handle that situation in that way? And then they might say, well, yeah, so one of my personal values is, I'll give just personal examples like truth over peace, which is like, hey, I'm accountable for making sure we get to the best overall answer, even if that means stepping on toes or having uncomfortable conversations. And then I might ask them something like, has that way of thinking always been the case, or can you remember a point in time where that really became real for you, or like a very authentic part of how you lead? And then you get to hear probably another incredible story, like a formative one. And you might, just keep going. You're really trying to understand there's like intrinsic or like durable motivations, values, and principles. Because your first degree answer is like a specific example. What you're really trying to understand is like, but how predictive is that to how they're going to show up in my context? And oftentimes you got to go a couple layers deeper. It's almost like you have the initial answer on the surface. You got to like dig a hole in order to like find the tunnel that you can like link back to your organizational context. And when you get there, you can develop a pretty genuine sense of, whether what they're talking about maps to, what it would take to be successful in your organization.
Awesome. Okay. Last one. And it's inspired by you because you talked about the power of being vulnerable and asking for going outward and asking for help. What's in the elevator rapid fire genre, what's the biggest challenge the people team that you're leading faces over the next 12 or 18 months? And how can I help you?
I would tell you that our biggest challenge at this point is actually a data and infrastructure challenge. We have built a lot, in service of what you and I have talked about today. We've redone our talent evaluation system, our total rewards practices and levers. We are now generating more of the data you would really want to have at your fingertips to understand to what degree are we growing talent density? What is the experience, really like here at Zapier, and how's that influencing folks' engagement, their productivity, and so on. So that's good. However, we don't have a unified way of looking at that yet. So this is one of those like not super. I mean, for some of us like me, it's actually super interesting, but it's like it's infrastructure work. And just like a product development team, sometimes you get really excited about shipping like a brand new feature. It can be a little flashier. That's not what's needed now. And so one of the things I talk about with my team is, when we're talking about, the next thing we should prioritize, like we got to go back to overall business impact. And sometimes that means we have to do something that is going to be less visible at first, less shiny, but it is, in fact, like this example, the next most important thing, or one of the next most important things we can do to build on everything we've built so far.
I think many of us dream of having that system and infrastructure in place to be able to do that. Brandon, Chief People Officer at Zapier, thank you so much for your time. You are clearly a talent all-star. We really appreciate you being on.
This is fun, Dave.
That's Brandon Sammut, Chief People Officer for Zapier. You can find him on LinkedIn. We'll put a link to his profile in the description below. Thanks for watching the show this week. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more episodes like this, and leave us a comment below telling us what stood out for you. And remember, we're an audio podcast too. We're in all the podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Just search Talent All-Stars and hit follow. I'm Dave Travers, and we'll see you right back here with another Talent All-Star next week.